All right. I think we are going to kick things off. I think we've got enough people online. So, firstly, I'd like to just welcome everyone to our second roundtable series. My name's Jonathan Deeg. I'm the Managing Director of the Deeg Group. Today we've got a really exciting presenter, Jamie Bunn, who I'll introduce you to in a second. But I did want to, just say welcome to everyone. We're obviously coming towards the end of our stage 4 lockdown with obviously our Sunday night announcement coming up, where hopefully we might have some ease restrictions. But we've been talking internally about how to communicate to our clients and all around Australia in these times, and it's a difficult one because we've been in this, in this crisis now for such a long period of time. But we've set out a great group of speakers over this next 5 and 6 week period. So we think that you should get some value out of it. And with really only such a small amount of time coming up between now and Christmas, I think it's a real opportunity to get a lot done and get set for the big 2021. So I will now introduce you to Jamie. Jamie's actually been a part of the Deeg Group and the Deeg family for a long period of time. He's been a tenant of ours at 1 Queens Road and a part of our APSO team there. And he's also worked with a lot of our key staff, executives and management in the Deeg Group and all our associated businesses. So it's been a fantastic help for us in the leadership part of our business. So he's got over 20 years experience in the high performance of leadership across a broad range of industries. He works with key CEOs, executives and government leaders. His particularly focus has been technology, and he's sold his first business in the early 90s, and he's helped a lot of other tech businesses throughout the period. So I'll hand you over to Jamie now, who'll talk us through how to pivot in a crisis. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Jono. I'll start sharing the presentation for everyone as well. And today, welcome. And we're going to be talking about how to pivot in a crisis. And most importantly, I think for you, we're going to develop a formula. And this formula you'll be able to apply immediately. We'll talk about some people and some resources that I suggest you can turn to and have some practical takeaways that you can absolutely implement and take your business forward. So let's talk exactly about the agenda. We're going to explore what is a pivot. I think that's an important place to start because it gets used ubiquitously and interchangeably with innovation, with product augmentation. And really, whilst they have a relationship with pivoting, they are not pivoting as defined by Eric Ries, who first coined the phrase with regard to startup and business. We're also going to talk about what it's not. I think that that's also powerful in terms of setting some boundaries around pivoting, and it also gives you access to using it in your business immediately. Of course, there are some myths around pivoting, and we're going to talk about what I see as the 7 key myths that I guess are recurring and repeated themes, not only in the last 6 months, but really over the last 5 to 10 years with my clients. And most importantly, what are the myths and their relationship with the realities? So not only am I going to cover the myths, I'm going to give you some counter realities that you should focus on as part of your pivoting strategy. We're going to talk about pivot readiness and what that is as a state and what relationship that has with your business. We're going to talk about some iconic non-pivoters and explore the range of non-pivoters, and that will hopefully help you frame some of the mistakes that they've made so that you can avoid them in the future. And then exactly what is this mystical pivot formula? We'll talk about that. I'll then sum up and we'll open the webinar up to questions. So, Eric Ries, a well-known author and commentator in the space, in his book, The Lean Startup, defined a pivot as a change in strategy without a change in vision. Now, immediately, if you choose to accept this definition, it frames up its relationship with innovation. Innovation being a new product, an idea that turns into a new product or service, whereas product augmentation is obviously a new feature that you're adding to an existing product. So whilst pivoting may be based on innovation, it may be based on product augmentation. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes pivoting is about doing less. Sometimes pivoting is about looking at what you're doing and actually refining it down to a point of specialization. So let's talk about some famous pivots. Now, I doubt many of you have heard of the online game called Game Never Ending, but I'm pretty sure you've heard of Flickr. Well, Game Never Ending was its original form. And what they discovered was they had an aspect of this life cycle game where you could upload photos. It was one feature in a host of a much more complex ecosystem, much more complex game. And what they decided to do was refine to what we now know as Flickr. Suzuki, I think, is worth mentioning because obviously it's over 100 years old and pivoting is not new. Suzuki originally made weaving machines and then they lent into their engineering skills. They looked at the consequences of the war and they decided to do motorized bicycles, which then turned into motorbikes, which then turned into cars. Instagram was originally just a check-in app, much like Foursquare was around 5 to 10 years ago. You would check in with Foursquare when you went to a cafe. Instagram started up like that and obviously is evolved into this unbelievable social media tool. Groupon started its existence as The Point. The Point was a protest site or a site where you would put up online petitions in order to get support for a particular point that you were trying to make. And what they did was they recognized there was a business opportunity in this. And I don't know about you, but Groupon's first product was a 2-for-1 pizza voucher to the pizza store below where they were operating. And, you know, who would have thought that that then meant it would burgeon into the fastest billion-dollar revenue business ever of all time. Twitter was originally called Odeo being a podcasting site, and now obviously become Twitter, a social media tool. PayPal was actually originally used in the Palm Pilot and for Palm Pilot to Palm Pilot payment transactions. It's obviously developed into this much bigger ecosystem of payments now and is, you know, threatening the banks. YouTube again was originally a much more complex, larger ecosystem of dating. And what they found was, although the dating was based on obviously video uploads, people were starting to upload many more videos beyond themselves talking to camera and talking about themselves and their characteristics. They started uploading videos of interest on a suite of things and now become the behemoth YouTube today. Verve Clicquot, I thought, was worth mentioning. This is a 200-year-old pivot. It's certainly one of my wife's most admired pivots, as I'm sure it is for many of you out there. When Madame Clicquot took over in 1805, she was the ripe old age of 27. She was a female. There was the Napoleonic Code in place, which meant women were not allowed to own a business or vote or participate actively in commerce in any way unless they were a verve, unless they were a widow. Between 1805 and 1810, there was the Napoleonic Wars, and there was basically no trade, not unlike right now. Very limited trade. And what Madame Clicquot did was she then started to set up some relationships and started to refine what she was going to offer. She looked at the suite of products that they had and the suite of businesses, from textile to banking, some other trading, and then, of course, champagne. And she decided to, again, refine, not add complexity, but actually reduce and focus on champagne. Madame Clicquot, in her lifetime, invented vintage champagne as a pivot. She also invented rosé champagne, and she actually invented Ridley, which is the clarifying of champagne. Now, she 50x'd her business in her lifetime, and she pivoted a number of times, but it started by actually refining down to absolute focus. And that's why it's important for you to understand that pivoting is not just about big ideas. It's not about new innovations. It's not about this huge emphasis on just the flow of newness and new ideas. Sometimes it's about refining down. Sometimes it's about ideas, but not always. It's also not just for startups. Obviously, I've just been through a couple of examples there. And granted that the startup is well positioned to take advantage of pivoting because culturally, they're in the mindset. The leaders are in the mindset. The culture is in the mindset. They're almost expected to come up with a pivot. They don't always, and we'll go through some of the famous non-pivoters a little bit later. But I would also argue that seasoned business and seasoned business people are almost better positioned for a pivot because they've got infrastructure, they've got business experience and acumen. And if you start to accept that pivoting is actually about the change of your business strategy without changing your vision, then it ceases to be a new age concept. It ceases to be emphasizing the startup, and instead could actually be a business approach for anyone. I think it's worth acknowledging the pressure that's in the system at the moment. Obviously, COVID-19, and Jono mentioned it earlier, who would have thought at the beginning of the year we'd be in stage 4 lockdowns with curfews and no trading for so many businesses. It's been absolutely dire. And that pressure, as we know, can absolutely create cracks. It can create cracks in ourselves and our business, but that pressure equally can create diamonds. And if you use the pressure at the moment, as a number of my clients have, as a number of businesses out there have, you can actually create a diamond that is a worthwhile pivot. And today, I hope that the formula I give you and some of the resources will send you on that journey immediately. So, 7 myths with regard to pivoting. It's really interesting, but with every subject matter that I explore, there's always a strong sense of mythology around them. And of course, you can come up with ideas that are the genesis for these myths, and businesses that are the genesis for these myths. But today, what we're going to be talking about are things that the majority of businesses can do, that something that you can actually actuate and do today, not sit there waiting. And this is the first myth I want to talk about, the flash of brilliance. This seemingly out of nowhere, without any context, insight that people get. And whilst a flash of brilliance obviously occurs, it tends to occur off a body of work, a body of understanding and deep understanding. Even the late, great Stephen Hawking, who famously had his flash of brilliance around the black hole radiation and the shrinking of black holes in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. I mean, he had a lifetime of work, a body of work and hard work that led him to that, and that then he ran with afterwards. So instead of relying on this out of nowhere flash of brilliance, I would argue that you should rely on sustained effort, sustained application of your intelligence, the intelligence of your business, and really cherish and nurture deep thinking in your business, not just shoot from the hip, not just ready, set, go, but in fact, explore and ideate to a great deep degree. Myth number 2, huge sudden internal shifts. If you've ever been in a board meeting where one of the directors says, right, we've got to change everything. We've got to absolutely throw out what we've been doing and start all over again. And we've got to have these huge seismic shifts within our business if we're going to respond to that, to the market environment, to the economy, to whatever. Now, whilst shifts are important, huge seismic shifts can be exactly that. They can be like earthquakes, and they can equally damage as much as they could potentially help. Instead, I would argue incremental shifts are far more powerful. Internal pivots. Look within the business. Do analysis on your profit centers. Do analysis on your efficiency. The Japanese famously coined the phrase Kaizen. Kaizen, this notion of continuous improvement. Toyota made it famous with their Toyota Way. And it is about the incremental as opposed to the seismic shift. And with the formula and some of the resources I'm going to go through a little bit later, you'll see that there's actually a way you can comprehensively audit your business internally to look at where you can create greater efficiencies and internal pivots to make your business more profitable. Myth number 3, it has to be completely new. It has to be out of the blue, completely new, never seen before. Well, you know, whilst that obviously occurs in the most rare of occasions, most pivots are actually built off other companies and other businesses' works. And when we explore a little bit later some of the non-pivoters, we'll see that some of the pivots that actually made it and the top businesses that you can think of now, Apple and Google, they were not first to market. The iPhone was not the first full face. I talked about the Palm Pilot earlier. That was a decade before the Apple iPhone. Steve Jobs admittedly did put some nice round corners on the phone, but really there was a decade, a body of work and other businesses. So instead of thinking about it having to be out of the blue and out of nowhere, I would argue that pivots are based on existing ideas, insights, and existing customer needs. And this gives you a place to start. You can look out into the marketplace, think about what low-hanging fruit, pardon the pun, given the slide, is available to you. And look at those existing ideas and insights and look at the customer needs. And are there needs that aren't being met that your business is well positioned to accommodate? You have to be the first to move. First. Again, this is not dissimilar to something original, but you know, if we were to actually put in order what number the most successful businesses that we can think of today, like Google and Apple, they weren't the first to move with regard to computers or phones or search engines or a number of different industries. And whilst being first to move plays to a type A personality, an alpha male or alpha female, yep, I've got to win sense, it actually, in the history of pivoting, in the history of business, doesn't necessarily work out. In fact, 30 years ago, you were advised in old school marketing that an initiator was an advantage. But today, with the speed of technology and communication, things can be mimicked, things can be copied and improved very, very rapidly. So instead of thinking about being the first to move, think about making incredibly smart moves. Think about being super mindful. Think about making the move that outwits the opposition, not outpaces them. All we need is ideas. There tends to be a massive focus on idea generation and the flow of ideas, and this notion that pivoting is based on that. And as I talked about earlier, if you accept that pivoting is actually a strategic shift, and that a subset of it is ideas, a subset of it is innovation, a subset is product augmentation, but there are other subsets like continuous improvement and refinement and better focus, then you don't need to rely so heavily on these new ideas flowing through and this constant well of ideas. Oddly, pivoting is really, really based on having great process and great frameworks. By having the right process, you can actually take an idea or a concept or a focal point and through that process, refine it. And by having frameworks within your business that allow you to do that, which again, I'll allude to when I go through the pivot formula, you'll be able to validate the idea or the concept or the move that you're going to make and have confidence in it. Because with pivoting obviously comes risk, and to address any risk, you need to have a due diligence process. So making sure you have process and frameworks that allow you to pivot is incredibly important, and far more important than ideas. Ideas, there is never a business that I've come across that is ever short of ideas. If you've ever got in an Uber, I'm sure that 9 out of 10 Uber drivers have got an app that they're working on. They've got an idea. There are ideas everywhere, but the process and framework to make them a reality and to make them profitable, that's another story. Myth 6, we just need a big insight. This is a classic marketing take again, and it's that big insight that just absolutely revolutionizes the market, that absolutely changes everything, that absolutely shifts the entire business rapidly and all of a sudden and profoundly. Well, instead of thinking about what is that massive insight, I would argue that it's much better to create leadership, create pivot leadership, focus on developing the leadership in your business that will allow you to promote the flow of not only ideas, but insights, promote innovation, promote product augmentation, promote refinement of the process, promote Kaizen. And not only from extroverts, so not only at the board table when there's a team meeting, and not in these brainstorming sessions that are very orientated towards obviously extroverts, but fostering introverts. So for those who need to go away and think deeply and take a night or take 2 days to think about something. So pivot leadership is about having that sensibility and understanding of your team, and not just getting in a room and saying, right, we're going to brainstorm our way out of here. In fact, a number of my clients have talked about how when they've tried to do that, actually they end up more in conflict than they do in creating ideas. And the ideas and the insights often happen when they're away from the boardroom, when they're out surfing, when they're out hiking, when they're out walking, when they're out exercising to some degree, or cycling. Because, you know, the mind and its ability to solve problems is extraordinary, but our minds work to different environments depending on whether we're more introverted or more extrovert, and we are all both, and we are all one or the other depending on the circumstance, and we do have preferences, and it's important to understand that. JFK was a brilliant example of that. He avoided the Bay of Pigs incident where the CIA had back-channeled a couple of $100 million into some rebels to take out Castro. He was being very much forced in the direction. Nuclear war was seemingly imminent and the end of the world. And he avoided it by slowing people down, by giving them external mentors, by making sure that he wasn't making decisions on the spot in a rapid fire way. And it was actually brilliant leadership that managed to pivot an entire country, an entire national crisis. You could argue that maybe some of the politicians now could benefit from such an approach. Something's happened. Myth 7, it's about a lone genius. So again, if you're overemphasizing the creative aspect of pivoting, then what a lot of businesses do is they'll turn to this lone genius, this wacky professor who might be absolutely brilliant. But pivoting, given that it's a strategic move, can't rely on a lone genius. And a business can't rely on lone geniuses as a risk. I mean, it's too much of a bottleneck. You can't be sitting there going, well, hopefully this one guy or girl will come up with an idea that will save us all. Instead, it's about creating a pivot culture, a culture of pivoting. It's a creative culture, and people often say to me, "I'm not very creative," or "That person isn't very creative." And my answer to that is that you're not understanding the creative process. Ideation is a process. If you look at even the best examples of innovation, if you go to the web and you explore innovation itself and ideation, there's always someone with a new process. And yes, part of that process is absolutely creating ideas and coming up with ideas, but it's only one part of 4, 5, 6 different stages. It depends on how you look at it. But creativity, for it to take an idea and have a pivot culture and then turn it into an actual business proposition, you need to have diversity of ideas and diversity of problem-solving styles. It can't just be a creative genius. You need to have people who are great at expanding on existing ideas, people who are prepared to refine and look and analyze and improve, and then those who are able to look at the risk, look at the costs, look at the budget, look at the restrictions. You need all of that working together in order to create a pivot for your business in a sustainable way. So quickly, we'll just talk about some of the non-pivoters. Xerox, obviously everybody knows Xerox. Few people know Xerox actually created the first PC, but they thought that it would cannibalize their printing market. Yahoo were 100 times bigger than Google when Google entered the marketplace. Yahoo refused to pivot from the media revenue focus, and Yahoo took over. Atari, I mean, who doesn't remember having an Atari growing up? They were iconic and they were innovative when they first came into the market. But when Time Warner bought them and they got to the Atari 2600, they were required to invest and iterate. And they hadn't adopted this constant pivot culture and pivot mindset. And instead, they just said, no, we don't want to improve on the Atari because it's going to cannibalize our 2600 market. So they had the completely wrong mindset. And of course, it died. Kodak actually invented the first digital camera, would you believe? But again, they thought it was going to cannibalize the photographic market, so they didn't run with it. BlackBerry got stuck on the keyboards. MySpace was stuck in media and entertainment. It didn't have actually a technology background or directors, and so it actually tried to pivot without focus, and it had so many pivots on the table at once for product augmentation, perspective, innovation, and it couldn't bring it together. It's argued that actually MySpace should have, as soon as Facebook came out, just copied what Facebook did. But Facebook came out, and their product augmentation of being able to see who your followers were suddenly blew MySpace out, who had anonymous followers, and then obviously MySpace. Poor old Holden were investing in special vehicle V8s while the rest of the car companies basically in the world were looking at sustainable vehicles and electric vehicles. SUVs were coming on the market, and Holden were focused on their station wagon. Palm Pilot hit with a bang, as we talked about, had almost a decade of great technology and innovation, and then they failed to innovate. And again, Hewlett Packard didn't see the iPhone revolution as being a big enough step for it. and refused to pivot with it. Nokia, the flip down Nokia, again, was iconic for a period of time, but they didn't pivot from there. Fairfax Media. Oh, poor old Brian McCarthy famously said in 2004, 2005, the broadsheet will never die. He was investing in Tullamarine Airport, the massive printing press out there, while he should have been focusing on digital. Motorola, not a dissimilar story to Nokia. Obviously, Blockbuster never saw the internet coming. And so those are some just famous non-pivots I'm sure you've heard of. And the question that you've got to ask yourself is, who do you want to be? Do you want to be the non-pivoter? Or do you want to be the pivoter? And if you do, you've got to ask yourself, what is your pivot readiness? And pivot readiness is a state that your business needs to be in order to make the race happen. So where do you start with pivot readiness? Well, just like I talked about earlier in terms of the ideation process, problem solving actually has a process. And understanding what your preference is as a problem solver is incredibly important when it comes to pivoting. Because understanding yourself and having that self-awareness means that you can actually also manage yourself in a problem-solving environment, which means you stop labeling others as good or bad or negative and positive problem solvers, and instead understand that they have a different approach. The profile that I like to use is one called Bassador, BASADUR.com, BassadorProfile.com. And that was invented by Min Bassador, who was actually an internal innovation consultant for film of good P&G, I think it was, in the US. And he developed this process, and you can go online, it takes about 10 minutes, you just order certain words, and then it starts to give you understanding of what your problem solving style is. It's not the only one out there. It is one that I like to use and I certainly recommend, but understanding yourself and then being able to understand others and how you solve problems is absolutely critical to creating a pivot, to creating pivot readiness. You also need to understand your strengths. Now, strengths are not what you would typically report when you're in an interview or you're talking about your qualifications or your certification or your education. But what strengths are what are the repeated values, behaviours and beliefs that you display on an ongoing basis in the workplace that you can harness and you can use and understand. Again, if you can understand what your strengths are, you can understand what others are. You could also obviously be mindful of your weaknesses. And by getting a roadmap around your strengths, a roadmap around other people's strengths, you can then start to find your way towards pivot readiness. And obviously, if there are disparate styles of problem solving and there are disparate strengths, strength profiling has been around for a long time. Gallup do it here in Australia, as do many other providers, and identifying, what your top 5 strengths are out of a set of 20 is very common. But once you've understood your strengths, you've understood the other people in your team's strengths, you can then focus on creating balance. Now, what this means is that you can ensure that you've got a good diversity of strengths and you've got a good diversity of problem solving style. And if you don't, you can at the very least, compensate or counterbalance for those lacking strengths and consciously work them into the process, and everyone work together to offer that perspective, even if it's not their initial predisposition. And then, of course, you could also hire in. So I find a lot of clients use the strength profiling and the problem solving as a means of the last gate that they use for new hires, and certainly for critical hires, to understand how they will balance their leadership team. So if we're talking about creating pivot readiness, it's about understanding your own strengths and style and creating that good understanding within yourself. You then want to create a good understanding of your team your leadership team and create balance there. And then once you've got yourself and your leadership team sorted out, you can then worry about flowing that through your entire culture. Without understanding your strengths and your problem-solving style, you're essentially pivot blind. You're essentially going into it just hoping with a box on your head, and you know, maybe it'll work out for you, but on the whole, it tends not to. So let's talk about what the formula is. And don't worry, there's more detail to come. This is just the start. The pivot formula is about creating pivot readiness in your business. And once you've got your pivot readiness right, you then go and find the pivot points. And how do you find the pivot points? Well, so as we've talked about, it's about having a process and system and frameworks with regard to pivot readiness. So you need to have those in place. You need to have a pivot leadership team. If you don't have a leadership team that is ready, then your culture won't be ready. And if your culture and your leadership team won't be pivot ready, then there's no point even trying. But once you've got that right, you've then got to identify what the pivot points are. And that's about systematical analysis of your people, your products, your process, your systems, your structures, and your system and your symbols. And I'll talk about some tools and show you some how to do that. And then play to your strengths. So look at your business, look at what your capability and capacity is. Now, granted, it may not necessarily be one that is obvious to you, but by systematically exploring your internal capability, you will be able to also identify what your strengths are as a business. So in summary, pivoting is not about just about big ideas and flashes of brilliance and sudden internal shifts. It's about using proven methods and process for deep thinking and problem solving to find new points of focus for your business, to find what I call pivot points. Pivoting is a responsive state, and I would argue if we've learned anything from this crisis, it's our businesses need to be pivot ready. It doesn't mean you have to pull the lever and necessarily pivot, but being in a state of a responsive state with the right leadership and the right culture over time means that you'll have a more robust and more enduring business. And again, let's talk about some resources with regard to the pivot formula. Well, obviously, in terms of leadership and culture, there are numerous options out there. There are coaches like myself and other consultants who can help with regard to your leadership and your culture and getting it pivot ready. In terms of pivot points, there's boutique agencies as well as large enterprise companies. So in Melbourne, there's a couple of boutique agencies which I highly recommend, Agents of Spring and Lido Island. They have great, robust processes that they go through. Agents of Spring actually use the Ambassador process as part of their sprint that they do, and they are absolutely fantastic. Dublin is Deloitte's innovation business, and whilst I'm not sure how good they are at consulting around pivoting, certainly the tools that they have developed have become great hacks and they are readily available. In fact, the Deloitte's 10 types of innovation is fantastic. And what you'll see from this slide, this is a download you can actually get from Dublin's website, and go and have a look at their resources there. They're really well thought through. And you can use this very, very simply as an audit tool. So if you actually go through these 10 types of innovation, you can see that they've also got subsets. So it's not 10 types, it's probably 60 different possible pivot points here. And you actually shoehorn your business into these different subheadings. And what I mean by shoehorn is that when you first look at them, you might look at, for instance, the second column, second point down, freemium. You might not think that there's immediately a freemium product that you can offer, but I would ask you to challenge yourself on that and try and come up with one. And in fact, try and come up with an answer for each of these subheadings. And in doing that, you're going to expand the possibilities of pivoting for your business. And you can actually systematically go through your business from profit model, network structure, process, product performance, product system, service, channel, brand, customer engagement, etc., etc. And it's a great tool, great hack. It's readily available and it's free. There are also a lot of heaps of books. Look, if anyone wants to reach out, I've been in this space for 20 years. I'm a big fan of Harvard. There are also some other great books out there which are all about helping you create pivot readiness through leadership and culture and stealing, both current and old ideas to be applied in this new context. So I'm just going to leave you with this formula up on screen just for a minute. I would urge you to think about how you can create this formula in your business. And I think, Jono, we're going to open it up to questions. Jono?
Hang on a sec. All right, I'm unmuted. I think Christina might just undo my video as well. All right, Jamie, thank you very much for that presentation. So first question is actually a question from myself. We've got a few other questions in there, but in regards to timing, what type of time would I put to pivoting in this current circumstance now? Obviously, there's a lot of things happening in the world at the moment with COVID, but like how much time would I allocate to my business and to my staff to say we want to focus this much time on actual pivoting at the moment? So call it out on a percentage base of things.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I suppose there's two ways to answer that. Google famously coined the time Google time, where they allow their employees 20% of the week to explore innovation and iteration. And I think that, in their context that of obviously a platform-based business, that makes sense. But the reality from a business sense is it depends on how much restriction and income loss and pressure there is on your business right now. So some businesses have experienced a softening, 10 or 20%. Some people have halved their revenue. Some people have lost 90, 95. Some people have almost lost their entire business. So I would say it's in direct proportion to almost how much revenue you've lost from where you were to where you are now would be a good yardstick to determine how much time you should be putting into pivoting. Because the point about pivoting is to make your business more money and more profitable, obviously, in this instance. So it depends on how much pressure you're under. But certainly, I would say always have some and never have none.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Next question. Where staff say need to pivot within their business, how would you recommend that they communicate to their manager and their leaders?
Yeah, look, and this is a brutal reality. But if you don't have your leadership on board, there's probably very little point trying to steer the ship in a new direction. So this is when playing politics and being really mindful of your relationships is absolutely key. Because when you talk about pivoting, sometimes people react to it the same way they react to change. And how we know people react to change is 30% of people, or a third of people resist, a third of people are indifferent, and a third of people are, yeah, let's go, let's change, that's great. So without knowing anything about the details of your business, I would say go to the people who embrace change. Go to the most senior leaders. You've got to lobby them. You've got to get them on board. And don't just go to them with an idea. For God's sake, don't do that. Go to them with a process and an approach. Keep the idea for later, because you've got to get the leadership and the culture in the right place before you start throwing ideas into the mix. And you've got to start to create awareness amongst the leadership and the culture around, as I said before, problem-solving styles and strengths of the business and strengths of the individual in order to have a balanced team so that you can actually do something with the ideas.
Okay. All right, and we've got one last question, which could be, it's an interesting question, but how do you assess or minimize the risks of pivoting?
Yeah, so, it's a great question. and risk is always present. And I think that I would say that it's one of the biggest arguments to the formula that I've come up with. And so playing to your strengths, making sure that your leadership team is in the right mindset, making sure that you've got the right leadership culture, and making sure you've got the right processes and approaches and frameworks first and foremost. Then, play to your strengths. So look at your business and look at what your capabilities and capacities are, and look at what's within reach of those, not what's something completely out of the blue, not something you've never done before, that has no relationship with your current play. Look at the marketplace, do market research, and you can do market research in really smart ways. And, with data analytics and great research these days, there's so much information. So don't rush into it, and make sure that you've got the research to back up the play. Now, what it means, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be slow either. It's just have a proper process, take the time, act with mindfulness, and also develop an MVP. So in tech world, which I do a lot of work in, they have this MVP concept, which is your minimum viable product. So you don't have to create the gold standard straight out of the blocks, but you can dip your toe in. Dipping your toe in allows you to see market response. It allows you to minimize investment up front. It allows you to see what pivots should be made. And just overall, be systematic. Don't be chaotic with your approach. And I think that, if you can audit your internals using, for argument's sake, the 10 types of innovation, you're going to be de-risking the whole approach as you go through the rigor of that process.
All right, very good. All right, well, Jamie, we really appreciate your time today. There's been some great insights, and got me a little bit fired up to get cracking for these next few weeks. So, again, from the D group, thanks very much. We appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you around 1 Queens Road as soon as we're all back in the office.
Yeah, well, thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Of course, feel free to reach out to the D group or to myself.
Yeah, we've got our details up there for any other questions to shoot through to Jamie. So thanks again, Jamie. Chat to you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.